Picture this. It is April 9th, 1241, and you are a Hungarian scout perched in the frozen branches of an oak tree near the Sajo River. Your breath comes in clouds of white mist. Below you, stretching to the horizon like a nightmare made flesh, is the Mongol horde, 50,000 horsemen moving in perfect silence across the snow. You have been watching them for 3 days now, and something is very wrong. They are not attacking, they are not raiding, they are simply positioned along the western bank of the river, waiting. You squint through the morning fog and realize with cold horror what they are doing. They are studying the ice. They are measuring it. They are testing it with their horses. And in that moment, you understand. The river you thought was your fortress is about to become your grave. You scramble down from the tree, mount your half-starved horse, and ride like a man possessed toward the Hungarian camp. You need to warn King Bela. You need to tell him that the Mongols are not just warriors. They are engineers of death. But when you burst into the command tent, mud-splattered and wild-eyed, the nobles laugh at you. They call you a coward. They tell you the river is impassable. They tell you the Mongols are just Asiatic savages who got lucky against the soft Russians and the disorganized Poles. They tell you that Hungarian heavy cavalry, the finest in Christendom, will crush these steppe barbarians the moment they dare to cross. You try to explain what you saw, the discipline, the silence, the calculations, but they do not listen. They cannot imagine that an army of horsemen from the ends of the earth could outsmart the kingdom of Hungary, so you stand there, helpless, as they dismiss you from the tent. You walk out into the freezing dawn and look across the river at the Mongol campfires, and you know, with absolute certainty, that in less than 48 hours, the Hungarian army will cease to exist. Before diving into this forgotten catastrophe, if you enjoy learning about the moments that changed the course of European history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient battles together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. To understand why the Battle of Mohi became such a slaughter, you have to understand that Hungary in 1241 was not some backwater kingdom waiting to be conquered. It was a major European power. It was the eastern shield of Christendom. It was rich, organized, and militarily formidable. The Hungarians had spent 3 centuries carving out a kingdom in the Carpathian Basin. They had converted to Christianity. They had beaten back German emperors, Byzantine armies, and endless waves of steppe nomads. They knew how to fight cavalry. They had been doing it for generations. King Bela IV was a reformer. He was trying to modernize Hungary, to centralize power, to build a state that could rival France or the Holy Roman Empire. He had brought in German settlers to develop mining and agriculture. He had fortified his borders. He had created a professional heavy cavalry force equipped with the best armor money could buy. On paper, the Hungarian army that gathered at Mohi was terrifying. 65,000 men. 20,000 of those were fully armored knights and heavy cavalry. These were not peasants with pitchforks. These were professional killers mounted on massive war horses bred for shock combat. The Hungarian military doctrine was simple and effective. Heavy cavalry charges, overwhelming force concentrated at a single point. It was the same philosophy that made the French gendarmes unstoppable. It was the same system that had dominated European warfare since Charlemagne. Charge with enough weight, and you shatter any enemy formation. It had worked for centuries. There was no reason to think it would not work again. But Bela had a problem. He was not just fighting an external enemy, he was fighting his own nobility. The great Hungarian magnates hated his reforms. They hated his centralization. They hated the fact that he was stripping them of their ancient privileges. Many of them had been hoping for an excuse to humble the king. The Mongol invasion gave them that excuse. When Bela called for the general mobilization, the magnates came. But they came slowly. They came grudgingly. They brought their retinues, but they withheld their full enthusiasm. This fractured command structure would prove fatal. The Hungarians also suffered from a fatal case of strategic myopia. They looked east and saw the Mongol conquests of Russia and the Cumans, and they dismissed them. The Russians were disorganized. The Cumans were nomads fighting nomads. Hungary was different. Hungary was civilized. Hungary had stone castles, professional armies, and the blessing of the Pope. The idea that horse archers from Mongolia could threaten the kingdom was laughable to most Hungarian nobles. It was the same arrogance that would later doom the French at Crécy, the Ottomans at Lepanto, and the British at Isandlwana. It was the arrogance of a culture that believed its own propaganda. So, when the refugees started pouring across the Carpathians in 1240, Telling stories of cities burned and populations exterminated, the Hungarian court listened politely and did nothing. When the Cuman tribes, fleeing the Mongol advance, begged for asylum in Hungary, Bela accepted them, not out of generosity, but because he thought he could use them as a buffer. 40,000 Cuman warriors settled in Hungary. They were supposed to be allies. Instead, they became a source of chaos and suspicion. The Hungarian population hated them. Riots broke out. The Cumans were accused of being Mongol spies. In the winter of 1241, a mob murdered the Cuman Khan in Pest. The remaining Cumans, enraged and betrayed, rampaged through the countryside and then fled south toward the Byzantine Empire, burning Hungarian villages as they went. This internal collapse happened just as the Mongols were crossing the Carpathians. Bela had lost 40,000 cavalry before the war even started. He had alienated potential allies. And he had proven to his own people that he could not maintain order. The stage was set for disaster. But the Hungarians still believed they could win. They believed in their armor. They believed in their castles. They believed in their god. They were about to learn that belief is not enough when you are facing an enemy that has spent 2 decades perfecting the art of annihilation. The Mongols did not just stumble into Europe by accident. They arrived with a plan, and that plan had been in motion for over a year. To understand the horror that was about to unfold at Mohi, you need to understand the machine that was rolling toward Hungary. The Mongol Empire in 1241 was not a barbarian horde. It was the most sophisticated military organization on the planet. It was a learning machine that absorbed the tactics and technologies of every enemy it defeated and then improved them. The architect of the Hungarian campaign was Subutai. If you have never heard his name, you should have. He is one of the greatest military commanders in human history. He conquered more territory than Alexander, Hannibal, and Napoleon combined. He fought in more than 60 major battles and never lost. He was 70 years old when he invaded Hungary, and he was still sharper than any general Europe had ever produced. Subutai did not believe in fair fights. He believed in reconnaissance, deception, and overwhelming violence applied at the point of maximum vulnerability. For 18 months before the invasion, Mongol scouts had been infiltrating Europe disguised as merchants and refugees. They had mapped every road, every river, every ford. They knew the political situation in Hungary better than Bela did. They knew about the civil unrest. They knew about the Cuman crisis. They knew exactly where and when to strike. The invasion force was divided into multiple columns. This was not a horde blundering forward. It was a coordinated pincer movement executed across a front of over 1,000 miles. One column moved through Poland to tie down northern European reinforcements. Another column swept through Transylvania to cut off any retreat south. The main force, under Subutai's direct command, advanced through the Carpathian passes toward the Hungarian heartland. Each column moved independently, but in perfect synchronization. They communicated using a sophisticated system of mounted couriers that could cover 100 miles a day. The Mongol soldier was a product of brutal natural selection. He grew up in the saddle on the steppes, where weakness meant death. By the time he joined the army, he had already survived childhood in one of the harshest environments on Earth. He could ride for days without rest, living on dried meat and fermented mare's milk. He could sleep in the saddle. He could shoot a bow with lethal accuracy while galloping at full speed. And most importantly, he was part of a disciplined unit that operated like a single organism. The Mongol tactical system was elegant and terrifying. They fought in units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each unit had a specific role. The vanguard was light cavalry, horse archers whose job was to harass the enemy, probe for weakness, and lure them into traps. Behind them came the heavy cavalry, armored horsemen equipped for close combat. Behind them came the reserves, fresh units ready to exploit any opening. And controlling it all was a command structure that used flags, drums, and messengers to coordinate movements in real time across miles of battlefield. But the Mongols were not just cavalry. They had absorbed the siege technology of China and Persia. They brought catapults. They brought engineers who could build pontoon bridges in hours. They brought specialists in pyrotechnics who could create smoke screens and terror weapons. They were a combined arms force before Europe even understood the concept. And they had one advantage that no European army possessed. They were not fighting for land or loot. They were fighting for the Mongol Empire, an ideology that demanded absolute submission or total annihilation. The Hungarian scouts who first encountered the Mongol vanguard in March of 1241 sent back reports that their commanders dismissed as fantasy. They described armies that moved faster than any European force. They described discipline that seemed inhuman. They described tactics that violated every rule of chivalric warfare. The Mongols did not charge bravely. They retreated constantly, drawing the enemy forward. They did not stand and fight. They dispersed and reformed. They did not respect the conventions of medieval combat. They killed everyone. King Bela, to his credit, tried to prepare. He called the general levy. He summoned every knight and man-at-arms in Hungary. He sent desperate letters to the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor begging for reinforcements. But those reinforcements would never come. The Polish and German princes were busy dealing with their own Mongol columns. The Pope wrote a letter of encouragement, but sent no troops. Hungary was alone, and Bela's own nobles were more interested in using the crisis to weaken him than in saving the kingdom. By early April, the Hungarian army had concentrated near the town of Pest on the Danube. It was a massive force by medieval standards, over 60,000 men, but size was not the same as quality. Half of them were poorly armed peasant levies. Many of the knights were more loyal to their local lords than to the king. The command structure was a chaotic mess of competing egos, and worst of all, they had no real intelligence on the enemy's location or intentions. The Mongols had systematically destroyed every Hungarian scouting party. Bela was marching blind. The king made a decision that seemed logical at the time, but was actually fatal. He decided to advance northeast toward the Sajo River to intercept the Mongol main force before it could penetrate deeper into Hungary. It was an aggressive move, exactly what a medieval king was supposed to do. Show strength, seek battle, crush the invaders before they could ravage the countryside. But Bela was not fighting a medieval enemy. He was fighting a predator that had spent 18 months learning how to kill him. The Hungarian army marched for 3 days through the cold mud of early spring. They moved slowly because medieval armies always move slowly. 60,000 men with their supply wagons, their camp followers, and their egos do not move quickly. The Mongols, watching from the hills, moved faster. They were always just out of reach, always visible on the horizon, always retreating. It looked like cowardice. It was actually a lure, and Bela, desperate for a decisive engagement, took the bait. On April 9th, the Hungarians reached the western bank of the Sajo River near the village of Mohi. Across the river, clearly visible through the morning fog, was the Mongol army. It looked smaller than expected. The scouts estimated 30,000 men, maybe less. Bela's commanders were ecstatic. They had the enemy cornered against a river. The terrain was perfect for a cavalry charge. The Mongols had nowhere to run. It was time to end this. The king ordered his army to make camp on the plain west of the river. They would rest, eat, and in the morning they would cross the stone bridge at Mohi, deploy for battle, and annihilate the Mongol horde. That night, as the Hungarians slept in their tents, supremely confident in their fortified camp and their numerical superiority, Subutai was finalizing his plan. He had spent 2 days studying the ground. He had identified every ford, every ice sheet thick enough to support a horse, every approach route. He had divided his force into multiple strike groups, and he had prepared a surprise that would turn the Sajo River from a barrier into a killing tool. The Hungarians had no idea that they were sleeping in a trap. They had no idea that the Mongol engineers had already scouted the upstream ice formations. They had no idea that Subutai was not planning to defend the river. He was planning to use it as a weapon. And in less than 6 hours, the Hungarian army, the pride of Christendom, would cease to exist. The Battle of Mohi did not start with a heroic cavalry charge. It started with a silent infiltration in the dead of night. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, on April 11th, 1241, while the Hungarian camp was wrapped in darkness and the sentries huddled around their fires trying to stay warm, Subutai set his plan in motion. The Mongols moved in absolute silence. They had wrapped the hooves of their horses in cloth to muffle the sound. They carried their weapons carefully to avoid any metallic clink. They had done this 100 times before in China, Persia, and Russia. They knew that the key to a successful night assault was not speed, but invisibility. If they could get into position before the enemy realized they were under attack, the battle was already over. The primary objective was the stone bridge at Mohi. This was the only major crossing point in the immediate area, and the Hungarians had stationed a detachment of knights to guard it. These were professional soldiers, well armed and alert. But they were not expecting an attack at 3 in the morning. They were expecting the Mongols to wait until daylight like civilized armies did. The Mongol vanguard crept toward the bridge. They moved in waves, low to the ground, using the natural cover of bushes and the riverbank. When they were within 100 yards, they paused. Then, at a signal, they erupted from the darkness. But this was not a wild charge. It was a coordinated assault. The first wave carried long pikes and shields. Their job was to create chaos and draw the defenders' attention. The second wave carried bows. They stayed back in the darkness and loosed arrows into the mass of confused knights. The Hungarian guards, jolted awake by screams and the whistle of arrows, tried to form a defensive line on the bridge. For a few minutes, they held. These were brave men fighting in full armor, but they were disoriented and outnumbered. The Mongols did not try to overwhelm them with a frontal assault. They simply kept up the pressure, pushing forward relentlessly, while their archers picked off any officer who tried to organize a defense. And then came the final blow. From upstream, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, a second Mongol force appeared. These were the heavy cavalry, the elite guards who wore lamellar armor and fought with lances and sabers. They had crossed the river at a ford that the Hungarians did not even know existed. The ice had been thick enough. Subutai's engineers had tested it 2 days earlier. The crossing was slow and dangerous, but it worked. And now, 2,000 Mongol shock troops were on the western bank, behind the bridge defenders. The Hungarian knights on the bridge realized they were surrounded. They tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The Mongols cut them down. Some jumped into the freezing river and drowned in their armor. Others tried to fight to the last man and were buried under a tide of steel. Within 30 minutes, the bridge was in Mongol hands. But the Mongols did not stop. They did not pause to celebrate or loot the bodies. They kept moving. The engineer units rushed forward with prefabricated materials and began repairing the bridge and building additional pontoon crossings. This was not improvisation. This was a pre-planned operation executed with industrial precision. By dawn, the Mongols had 3 crossing points operational, and the main force began to pour across the Sajo River like a flood. Back in the Hungarian camp, chaos was erupting. The sound of fighting from the bridge had woken the army, but in the darkness, no one knew what was happening. Confused nobles stumbled out of their tents demanding explanations. Messengers ran in conflicting directions. Some units began to arm themselves. Others assumed it was just a skirmish and went back to sleep. King Bela, woken by his commanders, tried to get a clear picture of the situation, but the reports were contradictory. Some said the bridge had fallen. Others said it was still being contested. No one seemed to know how many Mongols were across the river. Bela made a critical error. He assumed the attack on the bridge was a feint, a diversionary tactic. He believed the main Mongol force was still on the eastern bank. He ordered his army to form a defensive perimeter around the camp and wait for daylight. It seemed like the cautious, intelligent move. Let the enemy exhaust themselves attacking fortified positions. Then, when the sun came up, counterattack with the full weight of the Hungarian heavy cavalry. But Subutai was not planning to attack the camp head-on. He was planning something far more sophisticated. While the Hungarians were forming their defensive circle, Mongol cavalry was already spreading out around them like a net. Small units of horse archers were taking position on every side of the camp. They stayed out of sight, hidden in the trees and low ground. They were not there to fight. They were there to close the trap. As the sky began to lighten in the east, the Hungarian commanders finally got a clear view of the disaster. The bridge was in enemy hands. Thousands of Mongol cavalry were already across the river, and instead of forming up for a traditional battle, they were dispersed in a wide arc around the Hungarian position. This was not the kind of fight the Hungarians understood. There were no neat battle lines. There were no heralds exchanging challenges. There was just an ominous silence broken by the occasional whinny of horses and the creak of bowstrings. Then, as the first rays of sunlight touched the plain, the Mongols attacked. But it was not a charge. It was a storm. From every direction simultaneously, thousands of horse archers rode forward to within 200 yards of the Hungarian camp and unleashed their bows. The sound was like hail on a tin roof. Thousands of arrows arcing through the dawn light, falling into the packed mass of men and horses. The Hungarians raised their shields and crouched behind their wagons, but there were too many arrows coming from too many directions. This was the Mongol specialty, the feigned retreat and the arrow storm. They would ride forward, loose their arrows, and retreat before the enemy could close. Then they would circle around and do it again from a different angle. It was exhausting. It was demoralizing. And it was unstoppable. The Hungarians could not charge because there was no target to charge at. By the time the heavy cavalry spurred their horses forward, the Mongols had already wheeled away, laughing. For 2 hours, the arrow storm continued. The Hungarian camp became a pincushion. Men crouched in the mud, shields overhead, helpless. Horses screamed and bolted. Tents caught fire from flaming arrows. The wounded had nowhere to go. The dead piled up. And all the while, Subutai watched from a hill, calmly adjusting his strategy, sending messengers to shift units and tighten the noose. King Bela, standing in the center of the chaos, finally understood. This was not a battle. This was an extermination. The Mongols were not trying to defeat the Hungarian army. They were trying to destroy it. And they were succeeding. He called his commanders together for a desperate council. They had to break out. They had to retreat while they still had enough men to fight their way through the Mongol lines. The problem was, there were no gaps in the Mongol lines. Every direction was covered. Or was it? One of the Hungarian scouts reported that the road to the west, back toward Pest, seemed less heavily guarded. There were Mongol units there, but they looked thin, almost like they were inviting the Hungarians to attack in that direction. Bela's commanders saw this as a miracle, an escape route. They assumed the Mongols had made a mistake, left a gap in their encirclement. They did not realize they were looking at the killing stroke. Subutai had deliberately left the western road open. It was the final piece of the trap. He wanted the Hungarians to run. He wanted them to abandon their fortified camp and stream out onto the open plain in a disorganized mob, because that is when the real slaughter would begin. And the Hungarians, desperate and terrified, did exactly what he wanted. They ran. The retreat began as an organized withdrawal. King Bela ordered the heavy cavalry to form a rear guard, while the infantry and the camp followers moved west toward the illusory safety of Pest. But organization in a medieval army is a fragile thing. It depends on discipline, clear commands, and trust. The Hungarians had none of these. Within minutes of leaving the camp, the retreat turned into a rout. The Mongols did not attack immediately. They let the Hungarians get strung out on the road. They let them think they were escaping. And then, when the column was stretched over several miles, vulnerable and exhausted, Subutai gave the signal. The Mongol heavy cavalry, which had been held in reserve all morning, charged. They did not charge the front of the column. They charged the middle. They cut the Hungarian army in half like a knife through flesh. Suddenly, the rear guard was separated from the main body. The king was separated from his knights. And everywhere, Mongol cavalry was among them, cutting, trampling, killing. The Hungarian heavy cavalry tried to form up for a countercharge, but there was no room to maneuver. The road was clogged with fleeing peasants, overturned wagons, and panicked horses. It was chaos. The Mongol pursuit was relentless and methodical. This was not a spontaneous chase. It was a planned extermination operation. Mongol units, fresh and well organized, took turns riding down the fleeing Hungarians. When one unit's horses tired, they rotated out and a fresh unit took over. The killing went on for miles. The road to Pest became a graveyard. Bodies lay so thick that the Mongols' horses had trouble stepping over them. What happened next is what truly sets the Battle of Mohi apart from other medieval disasters. The Mongols did not just defeat the Hungarian army, they hunted the survivors. For 3 days after the battle, Mongol patrols scoured the countryside, tracking down anyone who had escaped the initial slaughter. They were systematic. They checked every forest, every village, every barn. When they found Hungarian soldiers, they killed them. When they found civilians who had helped soldiers hide, they killed them too. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was strategic terror designed to break the will of the entire kingdom. The Hungarian casualties were catastrophic. Out of 65,000 men who marched to Mohi, only 10,000 made it back to Pest. 55,000 dead in a single battle and the pursuit that followed. Among the dead were the finest knights of Hungary, the core of the kingdom's military power, and dozens of high nobles. The Archbishop of Kalaksa was killed. The Chancellor of the kingdom was killed. Entire noble families were wiped out in a single afternoon. The Hungarian state had effectively decapitated itself by concentrating all of its military power in one place and then losing it all at once. King Bela survived. He fled the battlefield with a small bodyguard and rode for days without stopping, always one step ahead of Mongol pursuit. He would eventually escape to the Adriatic coast and sail to Croatia, leaving his kingdom to burn. His survival was almost worse than death, because it meant he had to watch helplessly as everything he had built was destroyed. The Mongols did not pursue Bela to the coast. They did not need to. They had already won. With the Hungarian army gone, there was no force in the kingdom capable of resisting them. The Mongols spent the rest of 1241 methodically burning their way through Hungary. They sacked Pest. They destroyed Esztergom. They razed hundreds of villages. The death toll among the civilian population was in the hundreds of thousands. It was one of the worst demographic catastrophes in European history. But the true horror of Mohi was not just the numbers. It was the method. The Mongols had not won through superior courage or divine favor. They had won through superior planning, superior tactics, and the ruthless application of combined arms warfare. They had used the frozen river as a highway to bypass Hungarian defenses. They had used the terrain to trap a larger force. They had used psychological warfare to induce panic. And they had used disciplined pursuit to turn a defeat into a genocide. It was a masterclass in military efficiency, and Europe had no answer for it. The news of Mohi sent shockwaves across the continent. When the reports reached Vienna, Paris, and Rome, people could not believe it. Hungary, a major Christian kingdom, had been destroyed in a matter of weeks. Its army, larger and better equipped than most European forces, had been annihilated in a single afternoon. The implications were terrifying. If the Mongols could do this to Hungary, what could they do to Germany, to France, to Italy? The answer seemed clear: anything they wanted. In the spring of 1242, the Mongol army crossed into Austria. They raided as far as Wiener Neustadt, within sight of Vienna. Panic spread through the German states. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II called for a crusade against the Mongols, but no one answered. The crusading energy of Europe had been exhausted in the Holy Land. The German princes were too busy fighting each other. There was no coordinated response. Europe was defenseless. And then, inexplicably, the Mongols stopped. In the spring of 1242, Subutai received word that the great Khan Ogadei had died in Mongolia. Mongol law required all the princes and generals to return to Karakorum for the election of a new Khan. Subutai, ever the loyal servant of the empire, obeyed. He pulled his army out of Europe and marched east, never to return. Europe had been saved not by its armies, not by its castles, not by its god, but by a random death 6,000 miles away. But the damage was done. Hungary would take generations to recover. Half of the population was dead or displaced. Entire regions were depopulated. The kingdom never regained its former power, and the psychological scar of Mohi never healed. For centuries afterward, Hungarian mothers would frighten their children with stories of the Mongol devils who drowned armies in rivers and hunted men like animals. The Battle of Mohi was a turning point in European history, not because it changed the political map permanently, but because it shattered an illusion. Medieval Europe believed in the superiority of heavy cavalry, fortified positions, and chivalric valor. Mohi proved that none of these things mattered against an enemy who understood warfare as a science rather than an art. The Mongols had shown that discipline beats courage, planning beats improvisation, and ruthlessness beats honor. Yet Europe learned almost nothing from the disaster. When the Mongol threat receded, the kingdoms went back to their traditional ways of fighting. The lessons of Mohi were forgotten within a generation. It would take another 6 centuries and the invention of gunpowder, professional standing armies, and modern logistics before European warfare evolved to the level the Mongols had already achieved in the 13th century. In Hungary itself, the memory of Mohi became a national trauma. King Bela, who lived for another 29 years after the battle, spent the rest of his reign trying to rebuild. He constructed a network of stone castles across the kingdom, reasoning that the Mongols could destroy armies but struggled with sieges. He invited German settlers to repopulate the devastated regions. He reformed the military, trying to incorporate some of the lessons learned at such terrible cost. But the old Hungary, the confident kingdom that had marched to Mohi in April of 1241, was gone forever. The site of the battle itself became a place of mourning. For years afterward, the plain near the Sajo River was littered with bones. Peasants avoided the area, claiming it was haunted by the ghosts of the slain. Wolves grew fat on the remains. It was said that for a decade after Mohi, you could walk for miles on the road to Pest and never step on bare ground, only on the skeletons of the dead. The strategic genius of Subutai deserves a final word. He was 70 years old when he fought at Mohi. Most men that age in the 13th century were dead or senile. Subutai was directing a multi-front invasion across a continent he had never seen before, coordinating armies separated by hundreds of miles, adapting to European terrain and tactics in real time, and executing a battle plan that modern military academies still study as a masterpiece of operational art. He died peacefully a few years later, having never lost a battle. He conquered 32 nations and won 65 pitched battles. He is the most successful military commander in human history by any objective measure. Yet in the West, almost no one knows his name. The Hungarians knew it. They remembered. In their chronicles, Subutai was not a general. He was a demon. He was the scourge of God sent to punish Christendom for its sins. They could not accept that a human being, especially a pagan from the steppes, could outthink and outfight the finest Christian warriors. so they turned him into a monster. But monsters do not plan multi-stage river crossings. Monsters do not coordinate feints and ambushes across dozens of miles. Monsters do not study the thickness of ice to calculate load-bearing capacity. Subutai was not a monster. He was a professional. And that, in the end, was what made him so terrifying. The Battle of Mohi was not the end of the Mongol threat to Europe. They came back several times over the next few decades, raiding Poland and Lithuania. But they never again attempted a full-scale conquest. Partly this was due to internal Mongol politics. The empire was fragmenting. Partly it was because Europe, shaken by Mohi, finally started to adapt. Stone castles proliferated. Standing armies became more common. Intelligence networks improved. By the time the Mongols tried again, they found a harder target. But there was another factor. The Mongols themselves were changing. The empire was settling down. The descendants of Genghis Khan were more interested in ruling the lands they had already conquered than in expanding further. The age of world conquest was ending. The Mongols would remain a major power for centuries, but the terrifying momentum that had carried them from Mongolia to the gates of Vienna was spent. Mohi was, in retrospect, the high water mark. One more push and they could have taken Vienna, maybe even Italy, but they never got the chance. For Hungary, the aftermath of Mohi was a long, painful recovery. The population collapse was so severe that it took until the 16th century for the kingdom to return to its pre-Mongol numbers. Entire ethnic groups disappeared. The Cumans who had fled before the battle never returned. The Hungarian nobility, shattered at Mohi, took generations to rebuild their power. The kingdom became weaker, more dependent on foreign alliances, more vulnerable to external threats. When the Ottoman Turks began their expansion into Europe 2 centuries later, Hungary was no longer strong enough to stop them. The road to Mohacs, the disaster of 1526, where the Ottomans crushed another Hungarian army, ran directly through the killing fields of Mohi. But there is a strange footnote to this story. In 1285, 44 years after Mohi, a Mongol army returned to Hungary. But this time, they were not invaders. They were allies. The Golden Horde, the western branch of the Mongol Empire, had converted to Islam and was now fighting against other Mongol factions. They offered to help Hungary against a common enemy. The Hungarians, desperate for any assistance, accepted. The descendants of the men who had been slaughtered at Mohi fought alongside the descendants of their killers. History is full of such ironies. The lessons of Mohi were clear, but Europe was slow to learn them. Mobility matters. Intelligence matters. Discipline matters. Combined arms tactics matter. A smaller, well-organized force can destroy a larger, poorly coordinated one. These principles seem obvious now. In 1241, they were revolutionary. The Mongols understood them. Europe did not. And 65,000 men paid the price. The frozen rivers that Subutai used so effectively were not just a tactical convenience. They were a symbol. Europe thought of rivers as barriers, as defensive lines that protected kingdoms from invasion. The Mongols thought of rivers as highways. When winter came, the rivers froze, and the Mongols rode across them as easily as they rode across the steppes. The thing the Europeans relied on for safety became the thing that doomed them. It was a perfect metaphor for the entire campaign. The Hungarians thought their size, their armor, and their fortifications made them invincible. Subutai turned their strengths into weaknesses. The use of winter warfare was itself a Mongol innovation that Europe struggled to counter. Most medieval armies campaigned in summer. Winter was for resting, for staying in castles, for waiting out the cold. The Mongols did not care about comfort. They came from the steppes where winter was a fact of life, not a season to avoid. They used the frozen ground to move faster. They used the leafless trees for better visibility. They used the desperate need for warmth to force enemies out of fortified positions. Winter warfare gave them an advantage that European armies, raised in a culture that valued nightly tournaments and summer campaigns, could not match. The psychological impact of Mohi cannot be overstated. Before the battle, European kingdoms saw themselves as the pinnacle of civilization. They were Christian, educated, and militarily sophisticated. The Mongols were pagans from the edge of the world, savages who happened to be good at riding horses. After Mohi, that narrative collapsed. The savages had destroyed the civilized. The pagans had crushed the Christians, and they had done it not through luck or numbers, but through superior tactics and discipline. It was a humiliation that Europe tried desperately to forget. In the centuries that followed, European historians downplayed Mohi. They emphasized the battles where Europeans won, like the Battle of Annihilated, where the Mamluks of Egypt defeated the Mongols, or the various sieges where Mongol armies failed to take fortified cities. They ignored the uncomfortable fact that when the Mongols met European heavy cavalry in open battle, the Europeans lost, every single time. The only thing that saved Europe was distance and Mongol internal politics, not European military prowess. This collective amnesia was dangerous, because the lessons of Mohi were lessons that Europe desperately needed to learn. When gunpowder arrived in Europe a century later, the same kingdoms that had been destroyed by Mongol horse archers were slow to adopt firearms. They clung to the knightly ideal, the belief that individual valor and heavy armor were the keys to victory. It took the disasters of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, where English longbowmen slaughtered French knights, to finally break the spell. And even then, the transition was slow and painful. The Mongol military system that crushed Hungary at Mohi was not magic. It was the product of decades of refinement. Genghis Khan had created the basic structure, a decimal organization, a meritocracy, and a culture of ruthless efficiency. His successors, particularly Subutai, had perfected it. They studied their enemies, they adapted, they innovated. When they encountered Chinese siege engines, they recruited Chinese engineers. When they faced Persian cavalry, they learned Persian tactics. When they invaded Europe, they spent a year studying European warfare before committing to battle. This learning culture, this willingness to discard tradition in favor of what worked, was the real secret of Mongol success. Europe, by contrast, was hidebound by tradition. The way a knight fought was determined by his social class, his honor code, and centuries of precedent. Innovation was seen as cowardice or cheating. When the Mongols used feigned retreats to lure Hungarian cavalry into traps, European chroniclers did not praise it as clever tactics. They condemned it as dishonorable. This moral rigidity made Europe predictable, and predictable enemies are easy to destroy. The Battle of Mohi also highlighted the importance of logistics, a topic that medieval chroniclers rarely discussed because it was not glamorous. Subutai's army crossed 1,000 miles of hostile territory, maintained cohesion across multiple columns, and fought a major battle without running out of supplies. How? Because the Mongols had a logistics system that was centuries ahead of its time. Each Mongol soldier carried his own supplies, living on dried meat and yogurt. The army traveled with herds of spare horses, ensuring that they always had fresh mounts. They foraged ruthlessly, stripping the countryside of food. They did not need a baggage train. They were a self-contained war machine. The Hungarians, by contrast, moved with a massive baggage train full of supplies, armor, tents, and luxuries. This slowed them down and made them vulnerable. When they fled Mohi, they had to abandon all of it. The Mongols captured weeks' worth of Hungarian supplies, which they then used to continue their campaign. The Hungarians lost not just their army, but their ability to field another one. They had no stockpiles left. They had no equipment. They had nothing. Subutai had not just won a battle, he had destroyed Hungary's capacity to wage war. The role of intelligence in the Mongol victory is worth emphasizing. Before the invasion, Mongol spies had infiltrated Hungary for over a year. They posed as merchants, refugees, and wandering monks. They mapped the roads. They identified the key nobles. They learned the political divisions. By the time Subutai crossed the Carpathians, he knew more about Hungary than most Hungarian kings did. This intelligence allowed him to exploit the Cuman crisis, to anticipate Bela's movements, and to choose the perfect battlefield. The Hungarians, by contrast, had almost no intelligence on the Mongols. They did not know how many there were. They did not know their tactics. They did not know their intentions. They were fighting blind. And in warfare, blindness is fatal. The first Hungarian scouts who encountered the Mongols were killed before they could report back. The refugees who fled westward with tales of Mongol atrocities were dismissed as hysterical. By the time Bela realized what he was facing, it was too late. The aftermath of Mohi saw one of the great what-ifs of history. If Ogedei Khan had not died in 1242, would the Mongols have conquered all of Europe? It is impossible to know, but the military balance suggests they could have. There was no army in Europe that could have stopped them in open battle. The Mongols had already defeated the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Germans. They had raided Austria. The road to Italy, France, and even England was open. The only real obstacles were logistics and the lack of good pasture for their horses in Western Europe. Some historians argue that the Mongols would have struggled with the geography of Western Europe. The region was heavily forested, densely populated, and full of castles. Mongol cavalry tactics worked best on open plains. But this argument ignores the fact that the Mongols had already adapted to every other terrain they encountered. They conquered the mountains of Afghanistan, the jungles of Burma, and the river deltas of China. They were nothing if not adaptable. Given time, they would have figured out how to conquer France. Others argued that the Mongols would have been stopped by disease. The Black Death, which arrived in Europe a century later, originated in the Mongol Empire. If the Mongols had stayed in Europe longer, they might have spread the plague and destroyed themselves. This is plausible, but it is also speculation. In 1241, the plague had not yet emerged. The Mongols were healthy, well-fed, and victorious. There is no evidence that disease would have stopped them. The most likely outcome, if the Mongols had continued their conquest, is that Europe would have been absorbed into the Mongol Empire, just as Russia, Persia, and China were. The consequences would have been profound. Christianity might have been marginalized. The Renaissance might never have happened. The age of exploration might have been launched by Mongol-European hybrid empires rather than by Spain and Portugal. The entire trajectory of world history would have been different, all because of a river in Hungary and an old general who knew how to use it. But history turned on the death of a Khan in Mongolia. Subutai withdrew. Europe survived. And the Battle of Mohi became a footnote, a disaster that was quickly forgotten because remembering it was too painful. The Hungarians rebuilt. The Europeans went back to their old ways of fighting, and the lessons of the frozen river were lost. Until now. Because when we look back at Mohi with modern eyes, we see something extraordinary. We see a perfect example of operational art. We see combined arms tactics executed flawlessly. We see psychological warfare, intelligence gathering, and strategic deception. We see a 70-year-old general who understood warfare better than men half his age. And we see a frozen river turned into a weapon, a barrier turned into a highway, and a kingdom's confidence turned into its doom. The Battle of Mohi was not just a Mongol victory. It was a demonstration of how warfare would be fought in the modern age, centuries before the modern age began. If you have made it this far, you are clearly someone who values the deep, often overlooked stories that define who we are. If this story of tactical genius and strategic catastrophe resonated with you, please give this video a like. It truly helps these stories reach more people. And do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you do not miss our next deep dive into the battles that shaped Europe. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Could Europe have stopped the Mongols if they had continued west? Or was Mohi proof that medieval warfare was obsolete? Let the debate begin below.